Okay, so we're going to be rebuilding an FP2 front end case. All of the steps that we'll do apply to both front and back end cases. We'll just, for a back end case rebuild, you do not include the steps for the seal removal and install. I have laid out kind of the tools we need to use. So you'd have a pick, just a Sharpie for marking stuff, some kind of a small flat blade screwdriver, bottle of Loctite 641 retaining compound. Here I have just an old screwdriver that's kind of sanded down to get rid of the sharp edges. It's just kind of a generic tool, I guess, I don't know. And then we have this is a modified cold chisel that we ground down the edges to make it so basically doesn't chew up the end case when we remove the thrust washers. And then just a ball peen hammer and some acetone. And then, I don't know, you see this? So here's just a cheap soldering iron. We'll use that to remove the bushings. And then I have laid out here the parts that we're going to be replacing. So there's the seal spiral snap ring, the seal and the seal O-ring, and then there's the drive thrust washer and the idle thrust washer, and then the two 40mm sleeve bushings. They're interchangeable. Okay, so the first step before removing any parts, it's good to either take pictures or you can go through and mark the orientation of the thrust washers. So you can just mark based on what part they are. So on each thrust washer there's a relief channel, so I'll mark the orientation of the relief channels so I know which way to put them back in. And then I can label where the drive thrust washer and the idle thrust washer go just by putting a D and an I, so that I know which goes on the top and bottom. For removal of the thrust washers have basically a removal slot that is on the bottom side opposite of the relief channel, and that can be, you can use, a tool similar to this, kind of a rounded over chisel to basically go into that slot, and then I'll just use a hammer here to knock the thrust washer out. So you come in at an angle here, and then on the drive thrust washers, they're pretty, you can just kind of pry on them and they just come right out. So next I'll remove the idle thrust washer. They're a little bit harder to come out because they're stainless. So it'll start coming up a little bit, then you can move about 90 degrees and go in from the side. And then just flip to the other side. It pops out. So using a soldering iron with a chisel tip, we can melt the bushings out. I typically just melt the groove at the bottom side of the bushing all the way down until you reach the bushing bore, and then the bushing can be pretty easily removed by hand. Okay, so now that I have a groove melted through the bushing all the way down to the bushing bore, using the soldering iron, I can easily just remove the bushing by hand. So you can see here it's got a groove melted all the way through the bushing. Okay, so we'll be removing this seal spiral snap ring. So there's a little tab here at the bottom and you use just like a small screwdriver or a pick, and you get up underneath there and it comes out. So. Now I got that end lifted up and it just twists as it comes out. Okay, so for the seal removal, you can just use a rounded over old screwdriver. And we come in from the back side. It's easier once the bushings are removed, you get a little bit more room. So we come in from at an angle and just be careful not to gouge up the actual seal bore. So just focus it right on the back side of the seal. So I'll tap it out part way on one side and then I'll rotate to the other side. Get it the rest of the way up. Before installing the new seal, we'll go through and just make sure none of the old retaining compound is still in the seal bore. So I can take like a small, or just a straight pick, just kind of scrape it at the bottom where the seal O-ring will sit. And then you can take some light abrasives, something similar to Scotch-Brite, just kind of use that to clean all that old retaining compound out. Okay, now that I have the bulk of it cleaned up, I'll just take a piece of paper towel with some acetone and just clean it super good before I put the seal on. Okay, so the first step is put the seal O-ring. It goes in first. We don't use any kind of grease or lubricant on the O-ring. If you do, it will cause it to push out, so we put it in there dry. And then you take your new seal. We apply a small bead of Loctite 641 to the outside of the seal before installing it. And for the direction, for the orientation of the seal, the easiest way to tell which way to put the seal in, there's like a step on the back side of the seal or the bottom side of the seal that goes against the O-ring, so the smooth side of the seal faces out. Okay, so now that I have a bead of Loctite 641 on the seal, I'll install it with the step side pointing towards the inside of the pump. So then, using the arbor press and just a generic seal installation tool, I'll press the seal all the way down till it firmly seats against the O-ring. It takes a decent amount of pressure to fully seat it against the O-ring. You want to make sure that the O-ring compresses slightly so that it'll allow enough room for the seal snap ring to be installed. Before installing the seal snap ring, I'll go ahead and take my paper towel and clean any of that residual retaining compound out of the snap ring groove. Okay, for the snap ring install, you start with the bottom side of the snap ring, separate it, and then insert it into the groove, and then work your way around in a circular motion. So once the snap ring reaches the end, you should hear a nice positive snap as it sets in, and then make sure that a nice even amount of the snap ring is exposed, that it's not being held. So next we'll install the sleeve bushings. On the bottom side of the bushing there's a slight chamfer that has to go down. That's to make it easier to install the bushing. Basically it centers it up. So we'll take the same installation tool that we use for the seal, and it works also for the bushing. So on our thrust washers, there's a chamfer on the bottom side for ease of install, and then so the chamfer faces towards the bottom, and then the smaller relief cutout is on the top of the thrust washer. Okay, so for the thrust washer install, there's two cutouts in the thrust washer. One of them is a relief channel, and the other one is the removal slot. The removal slot goes on the bottom, and the relief channel lines up with the relief groove on the end case that we marked before disassembly. So first I'll install the drive thrust washer. So first you line up the relief channel with the one that you marked, and then kind of using a dead blow hammer, I work in a circular motion and try to keep it as even as possible so you don't break the bushing. So that you can hear that it bottomed out, so it's nice and flat. So next I'll install the idle thrust washer. It goes on the bottom, and so it's the same as the drive thrust washer with the relief channel facing towards the relief channel that we marked. It's the same process other than with the idle thrust washer. As we go down, it's normal for it to create some amount of metal shavings on the inside. So as I go down, I'll stop about halfway down and I'll blow out underneath the thrust washer, and then maybe when I'm about 3/4 of the way down, I'll blow it out again to ensure that no metal shavings get trapped underneath the thrust washer, causing it to not sit flat. So I'm about halfway down. So take an air gun and I'll blow out from underneath it. Now that I'm most of the way down, I'll blow it out one more time and then I'll fully seat it. So to check if it's fully seated, I just run my finger around the outside and make sure it's nice and even. For the different sizes of end cases, most of the same steps apply. The seal install is the same on all three, they're just a different size seal. This is an FP2 end case. The 2s, 3s, and 4s, so any of the larger sizes, all the same steps apply. On the two smaller sizes, on 1.5s and 1s, they're similar, but they do not have thrust washers. So instead of thrust washers, they have a flanged bushing. So effectively has a built-in thrust washer. On the 1.5s, on the drive, it uses the thrust washer or the bushing, the flange bushing as a thrust washer, and then on the idle side, it has a thrust washer built into the end case. So the idle side is not removable.